Stop everything you are doing right now, because what is about to be explained is not speculation, not analysis that will be revised by morning, and absolutely not the kind of geopolitical theater that gets dismissed as exaggeration within 48 hours. At exactly 0342 hours Zulu time, Iran achieved what every Western defense planner has characterized as the single most destabilizing weapons transfer in the entire post-Cold War era. The Islamic Republic has just taken possession of 48 DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicles from the People's Republic of China, and the number of minutes that Tel Aviv now has to respond to a launch detection has collapsed from 18 minutes to 6. 6 minutes, not 6 hours for political deliberation, not 6 days for diplomatic intervention, but 6 minutes from the moment Iranian early warning radars detect an incoming threat to the moment those DF-17s clear the atmosphere and begin their terminal approach phase against targets across the Eastern Mediterranean. The United States Navy has already begun withdrawing Carrier Strike Group assets from the Mediterranean operational theater, and that withdrawal is not a scheduled rotation, not a routine repositioning, and definitely not a confidence-inspiring demonstration of American commitment to regional allies. It is a retreat driven by the cold mathematical reality that American naval aviation, operating within 1,200 kilometers of Iranian launch facilities, has just become a suicide mission that no battle group commander can justify executing. This is the story of how a single weapons transfer accomplished in absolute secrecy has permanently altered the strategic geometry of the Middle East, rendered an entire tier of American military capability operationally meaningless, and forced Israel to confront the reality that its time-to-decision window has been compressed beyond anything its command structure was designed to handle. If this channel has been cutting through the official narratives and providing the kind of defense analysis that actually explains what is happening rather than what governments want you to believe is happening, right now is the moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the next 40 minutes will take you inside every dimension of this transfer. The technical capabilities that make the DF-17 fundamentally different from every ballistic missile system currently deployed in the region. The operational realities facing Israeli air defense networks that were never designed to intercept hypersonic glide vehicles. The strategic calculations that drove Beijing to execute this transfer despite explicit American warnings. The timeline of events that led 3 separate carrier strike groups to simultaneously alter their deployment patterns. And the civilizational implications of watching the world's most powerful military discover that entire categories of its power projection capability have been neutralized by adversaries who refuse to accept permanent subordination. The DF-17 is not merely another ballistic missile added to Iranian inventory. It represents a categorical leap in capability that renders every existing defensive architecture in the Eastern Mediterranean fundamentally inadequate. The system employs a DF-ZF hypersonic glide vehicle that separates from its boost stage at approximately 100 kilometers altitude, then executes a depressed glide trajectory at speeds exceeding Mach 10 while performing lateral displacement maneuvers that make intercept geometry calculations impossible for current radar tracking systems. The terminal high-altitude area defense batteries that Israel has deployed, the systems that represent the absolute pinnacle of American ballistic missile defense technology, were designed and optimized to intercept non-maneuvering re-entry vehicles following predictable parabolic trajectories against a target executing random lateral displacements of up to 70 kilometers from its projected flight path while traveling at hypersonic velocity through the upper atmosphere. That intercept probability degrades to effectively 0. The Patriot PAC-3 systems that form Israel's lower-tier defense layer face even more catastrophic limitations because those interceptors were designed for targets in terminal descent, not for hypersonic glide vehicles maintaining level flight at altitudes where atmospheric density remains too thin for effective maneuverability by the interceptor itself. The missile's range envelope extends beyond 2,500 kilometers when launched from Iranian territory, placing every Israeli population center, every airfield, every port facility, and every critical infrastructure node within strike radius. The payload capacity accommodates conventional warheads massing 1,000 kilograms, sufficient to mission-kill aircraft carriers, obliterate runway infrastructure, or collapse hardened command bunkers that were designed to survive near-miss nuclear detonations. The circular error problem probable, the radius within which 50% of warheads will impact measures less than 5 meters when terminal guidance is employed, making the DF-17 a precision strike weapon rather than an area bombardment system. That precision, combined with hypersonic velocity and unpredictable flight profiles, transforms the weapon into a first-strike decapitation tool, capable of eliminating Israeli command authority before decision-makers even understand they are under attack. But the truly catastrophic dimension of this transfer is not the 48 missiles themselves. It is what those 48 missiles represent in terms of Iranian strategic breakout. Beijing has not merely sold Tehran a batch of finished weapons. The transfer includes complete technical documentation, production licensing agreements, solid fuel composition specifications, guidance system source code, and Chinese technical advisors who will remain embedded within Iranian defense industrial facilities for a minimum of 36 months. Iran is not acquiring the capability to operate 48 DF-17s. Iran is acquiring the capability to manufacture an unlimited number of DF-17s using domestic industrial capacity, creating a hypersonic production line that will generate additional missiles at whatever rate Tehran's strategic calculations demand. Western intelligence estimates, based on Iranian production capacity for existing Sejil and Khaybar-Shakan systems, project that within 18 months, Iran could be manufacturing between 8 and 12 DF-17 equivalents per month. That is not a missile stockpile. That is a missile arsenal that grows faster than any defensive procurement program can possibly respond. The operational timeline that Israeli defense planners now face has compressed beyond anything that existing command structures can handle. 6 minutes from launch detection to impact means that the entire kill chain, detection through tracking, through targeting, through intercept, through battle damage assessment, must execute in less time than it takes to convene an emergency cabinet meeting. There is no time for political authorization. There is no time for target verification. There is no time for proportionality assessment or collateral damage evaluation. There is only time for automated response sequences that must be pre-authorized before any crisis even begins, which means Israel must now delegate civilization-ending decisions to algorithms and junior officers operating in underground bunkers without any meaningful civilian oversight. Every escalation theorist who has studied nuclear command and control understands that compressed decision timelines represent the single most dangerous structural factor in crisis stability because they eliminate the possibility of human judgment, preventing automated catastrophe. The Iron Dome system that has provided Israeli population centers with tactical defense against short-range rocket bombardment is completely irrelevant against hypersonic threats because the intercept geometry is impossible and the engagement timeline is non-existent. David's Sling, Israel's medium-range defense layer, suffers identical limitations because its interceptors cannot achieve the velocities necessary to catch targets already traveling at Mach 10, and because its radar systems cannot generate tracking solutions against targets executing unpredictable maneuvers. Arrow 3, Israel's exo-atmospheric intercept system designed specifically for ballistic missile defense, faces the fundamental problem that hypersonic glide vehicles do not follow ballistic trajectories and therefore do not pass through the altitude bands where Arrow 3 achieves intercept capability. Israel has invested billions of dollars across 3 decades building what military planners genuinely believed was the most sophisticated, integrated air defense network on Earth, and that entire architecture has been rendered obsolete by a weapon system that operates in flight regimes and velocity profiles that no component of the Israeli defensive network was designed to address. The targeting problem facing Israeli defense networks is not merely difficult. It is mathematically unsolvable with existing sensor technology. Current Israeli early warning radars can detect the initial boost phase launch of a DF-17 from Iranian territory, but the moment that hypersonic glide vehicle separates from its booster and begins maneuvering flight, every tracking algorithm breaks down because the radar returns no longer correspond to any known ballistic trajectory model. The glide vehicle appears on radar screens as a target that is simultaneously too high for terminal phase intercept systems and too low for exo-atmospheric intercept systems, traveling too fast for mid-course intercept while executing lateral displacements that make predictive targeting impossible. Israeli radar operators watching DF-17 approaches on their displays will understand that something is inbound, will understand approximately where it is at any given moment, but will have absolutely no ability to predict where it will be in 30 seconds, which means they cannot generate the intercept solutions necessary to task defensive weapons. What does Tel Aviv do when its entire defensive architecture becomes decorative? What choices remain available to decision-makers who discover that the fundamental assumption underlying their national security strategy, that advanced technology provides decisive defensive advantage, has been proven catastrophically wrong? The options are stark, and every single one carries unacceptable cost. Israel can attempt to destroy Iranian production facilities before they become operational, which requires deep strike operations against hardened targets defended by integrated air defense networks that have been specifically designed to defeat Israeli air power, and which triggers Iranian retaliation using the 48 DF-17s already in inventory. Israel can accept the new strategic reality and pursue diplomatic accommodation with Tehran, which requires abandoning decades of established policy and accepting Iranian regional preeminence. Or Israel can accelerate toward its own hypersonic weapons development program, which requires technological breakthroughs that American defense contractors have not yet achieved, and timeline compression that violates every known principle of weapons system development. None of these options restores the security environment that existed 72 hours ago. None of these options returns Israel to a world where its qualitative military edge provides strategic immunity from regional threats. The American response has been withdrawal disguised as routine operations. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, which has maintained continuous Eastern Mediterranean presence for 8 months, received movement orders within 6 hours of the transfer being confirmed by national technical means. The official explanation provided to media outlets describes a scheduled rotation and mentions upcoming maintenance requirements. The actual explanation, visible to anyone who understands carrier operating patterns, is that American naval commanders have concluded that operating a 90,000-ton capital ship carrying 75 aircraft and 5,500 personnel within range of weapons that can sink that ship faster than its defensive systems can respond represents an unacceptable risk that serves no strategic purpose. The Ford is not being rotated. The Ford is fleeing. And every naval power on Earth is watching American carrier groups demonstrate through their actions that the era of unchallenged power projection through carrier aviation has ended, because hypersonic weapons have made these massive vessels into floating coffins that prudent commanders keep beyond threat range. If you want analysis this deep, this unwilling to repeat official talking points, this committed to explaining what is actually happening rather than what press officers claim is happening, subscribe to this channel right now and make sure you hit that notification bell, because the coverage that follows over the coming weeks will document every dimension of how this transfer reshapes regional power dynamics. The Ford's withdrawal creates a capability vacuum across the Eastern Mediterranean that cannot be filled by any other American asset currently deployed. Land-based air power operating from bases in Jordan or the Gulf states lacks the responsiveness and flexibility that carrier aviation provides. Submarine-launched cruise missiles offer precision strike capability but cannot provide the persistent overhead presence that carrier air wings deliver. The diplomatic message being transmitted by this withdrawal is unmistakable to every government in the region. American security guarantees that depend on carrier presence have just been exposed as conditional commitments that evaporate when adversary capabilities make American commanders unwilling to accept operational risk. The Ford's departure is being followed by similar movements from the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Strike Group and the USS Harry S. Truman Strike Group, creating a comprehensive American naval withdrawal from the Eastern Mediterranean for the first time since the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The pattern is obvious to any analyst who understands naval operations. This is not scheduled maintenance. This is not routine rotation. This is strategic retreat driven by threat assessment that concluded American carrier groups have become targets rather than weapons. The implications cascade across every theater where American power projection depends on carrier presence. If carriers cannot operate within hypersonic threat range in the Eastern Mediterranean, they cannot operate within hypersonic threat range in the Western Pacific either, which means the entire American strategy for deterring Chinese action against Taiwan has been fundamentally undermined, because that strategy depends on carrier strike groups being able to operate within the first island chain despite facing Chinese hypersonic arsenals. Beijing's decision to execute this transfer, despite explicit American warnings, reveals calculation about American willingness to enforce consequences. Washington threatened secondary sanctions against Chinese defense contractors. Washington threatened technology export restrictions. Washington threatened diplomatic consequences and warned about impacts on bilateral relationship management. Beijing evaluated those threats, assessed American willingness to actually implement them given the current state of economic interdependence and diplomatic complexity, and concluded that the strategic benefits of arming Iran with hypersonic capability exceeded whatever cost the Americans might actually impose. That calculation represents a direct challenge to American hegemonic authority because it demonstrates that Beijing no longer considers American approval necessary before executing major strategic initiatives. The transfer happened despite American opposition, which means American opposition was revealed as ineffective, which means every other government considering actions contrary to American preferences now understands that American threats may not materialize into actual consequences. The Chinese strategic logic behind this transfer operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Arming Iran with hypersonic capability forces American naval assets out of the Eastern Mediterranean, which reduces American ability to project power into the Middle East, which creates opportunities for Chinese economic and diplomatic expansion throughout a region that Beijing views as critical to Belt and Road Initiative success. The technology transfer strengthens the Iran-China strategic partnership at a moment when both nations are pursuing visions of international order that explicitly challenge American hegemonic prerogatives. The transfer demonstrates to developing nations that advanced military technology is available from non-Western sources, undermining the American monopoly on cutting-edge weapon systems that has historically provided Washington with diplomatic leverage. And perhaps most importantly, the transfer establishes precedent that China will provide its partners with whatever capabilities they require to resist American pressure, which encourages other nations to deepen their own partnerships with Beijing. The Russian response has been satisfaction barely concealed behind diplomatic formalities. Moscow has pursued hypersonic weapons development for over a decade, specifically to neutralize American missile defense systems and restore strategic parity after decades of perceived American advantage. Watching Iran acquire similar capabilities from China serves Russian interests by forcing American defensive attention and resources to flow toward the Middle East rather than toward European theaters, where Russian and NATO forces face each other across increasingly tense boundaries. Every American interceptor, every radar system, every command facility that gets dedicated to defending against Iranian hypersonics is a resource that cannot be deployed to Eastern Europe. The strategic calculation is straightforward. Anything that diverts American attention away from NATO's eastern frontier serves Russian security interests by reducing the military pressure that Moscow faces from Western alliance structures. The regional realignment accelerating across the Middle East in response to this transfer will reshape alliance networks that have structured regional politics for 70 years. Gulf Arab states that have historically depended on American security guarantees are witnessing those guarantees being tested in real time as American carrier groups withdraw from threat range. The diplomatic recalculations are already underway in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha as leadership structures assess whether continued alignment with Washington provides the security benefits that justify decades of partnership. The visible alternatives are growing more attractive. China offers economic partnership without demanding domestic political reforms or interference in internal governance. Russia offers weapons technology and diplomatic support without moral lectures about human rights or democracy promotion. Iran, newly empowered with hypersonic strike capability, offers regional accommodation and economic cooperation to neighbors willing to distance themselves from American patronage. Turkey is watching these developments with strategic opportunism that has characterized Ankara's foreign policy throughout the post-Cold War period. Turkish leadership has spent the past decade carefully balancing between NATO membership and pursuit of independent regional influence. The American carrier withdrawal and Israeli defensive vulnerability create exactly the kind of power vacuum that Turkish strategy seeks to exploit. Ankara can position itself as an indispensable NATO member whose geography and military capability become even more critical as American presence contracts. Simultaneously, Turkey can pursue deepening partnerships with Iran and Russia that provide leverage against Western partners. The hypersonic transfer has handed Turkish diplomacy additional negotiating power by demonstrating that American security architecture in the Eastern Mediterranean has structural vulnerabilities that require Turkish cooperation to address. Pakistan represents another strategic beneficiary of this transfer because Islamabad has maintained complex relationships with Beijing, Tehran, and Washington simultaneously while pursuing independent nuclear capability and regional influence. The demonstration that China will transfer cutting-edge military technology to partners despite American opposition provides Pakistani leadership with increased confidence that their own Chinese partnerships can deliver advanced capabilities. The regional precedent established by the Iran transfer suggests that Pakistani requests for hypersonic technology or other advanced systems might receive favorable Chinese response, particularly if framed as necessary for deterrence against Indian conventional superiority. The transfer strengthens the axis of states pursuing strategic autonomy from Western-dominated international structures. The Global South is interpreting these events as confirmation that American hegemonic power is entering terminal decline and that alternative partnership structures offer viable paths to development and security. Decades of American dominance created international environments where developing nations felt compelled to align with Washington regardless of how those alignments served their actual interests. The visible retreat of American carrier power, the demonstrated ineffectiveness of American threats against Chinese weapons transfers, and the manifest inability of American defensive technology to counter hypersonic weapons combine to suggest that American hegemony was always more fragile than its proponents claimed. Nations across Africa, Latin America, and Asia are drawing obvious conclusions. Partnerships with rising powers offer access to advanced technology, economic investment, and diplomatic support without the interference and conditionality that characterizes American relationships. The historical parallels to hegemonic transitions are impossible to ignore for anyone familiar with how international orders transform. The British Empire's retreat from east of Suez in the late 1960s marked the definitive end of British global hegemony and opened space for American assumption of security responsibilities across regions that London could no longer afford to defend. The current American carrier withdrawal from the Eastern Mediterranean carries similar symbolic and practical weight. It marks the moment when the global hegemon acknowledges that certain regions have become too dangerous for its forces to operate within, which means those regions are no longer under hegemonic control, which means the international order is fragmenting into spheres of influence rather than remaining unified under single hegemonic authority. Every professional student of international relations understands that once hegemonic retreat begins, it accelerates because each withdrawal encourages additional challenges that force additional withdrawals. This night has permanently fractured the Middle Eastern security architecture that has existed since American hegemony was established in the region following the 1991 Gulf War. For 3 decades, American carrier presence in the Eastern Mediterranean and Persian Gulf represented the ultimate backstop, guaranteeing that no regional power could fundamentally challenge Israeli security or threaten the flow of energy resources that global economy depends upon. That era ended the moment the first DF-17 crate was unloaded at Iranian receiving facilities. The world has been permanently divided into 2 categories of nations. Those that possess hypersonic strike capability and can therefore deny access to their regions by traditional power projection forces, and those that lack hypersonic capability and must therefore accept that their security environments can be shaped by external powers. Iran has just crossed that threshold, joining China, Russia, and North Korea in the category of nations that can impose costs on American power projection that Washington considers unacceptable. Israel faces the most acute version of this transformation because its entire national security doctrine was constructed around qualitative military superiority that provided decisive advantage in any regional conflict. That superiority has been erased in technical dimensions that matter most for modern warfare. Israel can still defeat any conventional Arab military in tank battles or infantry combat. But those capabilities are increasingly irrelevant when the actual threats involve precision missiles arriving too fast for any defense to intercept. The compression of decision timelines to 6 minutes means that Israeli leadership must now choose between accepting vulnerability or pursuing preemptive strategies that carry civilization-ending escalation risks. Neither option restores the security that existed before this transfer. The American strategic community is confronting the reality that decades of investment in missile defense technology has produced systems that cannot defend against the actual threats that adversaries have developed. The entire architecture of ground-based interceptors in Alaska, THAAD batteries deployed globally, Aegis missile defense systems on destroyers and cruisers represents hundreds of billions of dollars spent building defenses against ballistic missiles following predictable trajectories. Hypersonic glide vehicles have rendered that entire investment strategically obsolete because the flight profiles are fundamentally different and existing interceptors cannot achieve the performance parameters necessary for engagement. The American defense establishment must now either acknowledge this failure publicly and request additional hundreds of billions to develop entirely new defensive architectures, or maintain the pretense that existing systems remain effective while privately understanding that they provide no meaningful protection. Subscribe to this channel because analysis this sharp, this unwilling to accept official narratives, this committed to explaining the actual strategic realities rather than the comfortable fictions, is not optional in a world this dangerous. It is necessary. Share this breakdown with everyone in your network who understands that what governments announce publicly and what actually occurs strategically are completely different things. The coming weeks will document how this transfer cascades through alliance structures, procurement decisions, and diplomatic realignments across every region where American hegemonic authority is being tested. The next phase of this analysis will examine the specific timelines for Iranian production scaling, the technical specifications of defensive systems that China and Russia are developing to counter American hypersonic programs, and the crisis decision-making frameworks that Israeli leadership must now implement to operate within 6-minute response windows. The world changed permanently tonight. The international order fractured. The assumptions that structured great power competition for 3 decades were revealed as obsolete. And the clear lesson transmitted to every nation observing these events is that American hegemonic power is voluntary rather than inevitable, negotiable rather than absolute, and defeatable by adversaries willing to develop capabilities that exploit its technical and strategic vulnerabilities. What comes next depends entirely on whether Washington possesses the strategic imagination to adapt to multipolar reality, or whether American leadership will continue pursuing hegemonic strategies in a world that no longer accepts hegemonic authority. Stay sharp, stay informed, and never stop questioning the narratives that power wants you to accept without examination.